Chicago, July 13, 1966. The heat was suffocating. The kind of summer night where the air itself seemed to cling to the skin like damp cloth. The city throbbed with neon light and restless energy, but somewhere on the quiet south side, at 2319 East 100th Street, the night seemed deceptively calm. Inside a modest brick townhouse, 8 young student nurses prepared to sleep. They were daughters, sisters, friends, women who had left their homes in the Philippines to train in America, chasing dreams of healing and of a better life. Their laughter had faded into whispers, the clinking of teacups replaced by yawns and prayers. For them, the world was still full of promise. But outside, in the shadows of that same Chicago night, something darker moved. A man without a home, without purpose, and without mercy, drifted through the city like a predator. His name was Richard Speck. Tall, lanky, tattooed and drunk. He carried with him only rage and a knife. He had been fired from jobs, abandoned by family, rejected by society, and now he carried the weight of all his bitterness in his shaking hands. Speck was not looking for money. He was not looking for shelter. He was looking to destroy. By dawn, Chicago would awaken to a crime so brutal that even hardened detectives would later confess they had never seen anything like it. 8 women, 8 healers would be dead. One survivor, trembling beneath a bed, would live to tell the story. And the name Richard Speck would be burned into history, not as a man, but as a monster who turned one ordinary night into a nightmare that still echoes decades later. This is not just a story of murder. It is a story of fear, of survival, of the fragile line between civilization and chaos. A story that forces us to ask, how much darkness can one man carry inside before it spills into the world? Welcome to Mr. True Death. This channel is not for the faint of heart. It is for those who dare to stare directly into the blackest chapters of human history. If you are ready to walk with us through the shadows, subscribe now, because tonight, we open the door on one of the most horrifying crimes America has ever seen. Richard Benjamin Speck was born on December 6, 1941, in the small, unremarkable town of Kirkwood, Illinois. At first glance, nothing about his beginnings suggested he would one day become a name synonymous with terror. He was the 7th of 8 children in a large, working-class family. His father, Benjamin, was a quiet, hard-working man who took his son fishing, taught him the value of discipline, and kept the household calm. For young Richard, those early years, though modest, were stable. There was love, routine, and the simple rhythm of family life. But stability is fragile, and when Richard was just 6 years old, his father died of a sudden heart attack. For a boy so young, the loss was seismic. The man he trusted most, the anchor in his world, was gone. And in that void, something began to fester. His mother, Mary, remarried quickly to a man named Carl Lindbergh, a strict, abusive stepfather whose presence transformed the home into a place of dread. Carl was a heavy drinker, violent and domineering. He had no patience for Speck's timid nature, no tolerance for mistakes, and his cruelty carved deep scars into the boy's psyche. Teachers would later recall that Speck was painfully shy in school, often sitting silently at his desk, avoiding eye contact, rarely speaking. His grades were abysmal, his confidence shattered. He began to escape the silence of the classroom and the violence at home through alcohol, first sneaking sips from bottles, then drinking heavily by the time he was in his early teens. Imagine a boy of 12, staggering home drunk through the streets of rural Illinois. That was Richard Speck, already dissolving, already slipping out of the ordinary world. By the age of 15, he had dropped out of school completely. Without education, without hope, and with an unquenchable thirst for alcohol, he drifted into petty crime, burglary, forgery, stealing cars. It didn't matter. The pattern was already forming. Arrest, probation, release, arrest again. A cycle of failure and defiance that only fed his resentment. His record grew longer, but so did his anger at a world he believed had cheated him. Neighbors would later remember a boy who seemed invisible one moment and explosively violent the next. He would smash bottles in drunken rages, brawl in bars, and boast of knives hidden in his boots. The alcohol, combined with his untreated head injuries from childhood accidents, seemed to flip a switch inside him. It was as if Richard Speck had lost the ability to feel empathy, to see other people as human. The transformation of Richard Speck from a fragile, shy child into a simmering young criminal was not sudden. It was a slow, relentless erosion. Grief, abuse, alcohol, violence, each layer peeling away whatever innocence he once had. By his late teens, he was already marked, a drifter, a petty thief, and an addict whose future was not one of redemption, but of destruction. By the time Richard Speck stumbled into adulthood, the The boy who once sat silent in his classroom had become a full-grown delinquent, restless and dangerous. His adolescence was a parade of police sirens, courtrooms, and jail cells. Burglary charges, disorderly conduct, vandalism, forgery. The list stretched on like a resume written in crime. Between 1955 and 1963, Speck was arrested more than 40 times. In every dusty police file, the same pattern appeared: intoxicated, violent, reckless, unrepentant. Alcohol clung to him like a second skin. He drank morning to night until his speech slurred and his temper snapped. The bottle was his escape, his companion, and his excuse. But when Speck drank, he became something else, something darker. Barroom fights were frequent. Once, after being thrown out of a tavern, he returned with a knife, slashing wildly at the door, daring anyone to face him. His thin frame and glassy eyes made him look half dead, but the fury inside him was alive, waiting for the right spark. And yet, Speck's life was not only the chaos of back alleys and jail cells. For a brief moment, he tried to play the part of a husband. In 1962, he married a young woman named Shirley Malone. Two outsiders, it seemed like a chance at redemption, a tether to normal life. But behind closed doors, the marriage was a battlefield. Speck was jealous, controlling, and abusive. He beat Shirley regularly, often while drunk, his paranoia feeding on itself. Their home became a prison where the walls echoed with shouting and fear. Shirley gave birth to their daughter, but even fatherhood could not pull him back from the abyss. By 1963, the marriage collapsed. Shirley filed for divorce, citing violence and neglect. Speck's only attempt at stability crumbled, leaving him more bitter, more isolated. Friends would later recall his voice slurred with rage as he cursed women, blaming them for his failures. To him, they were betrayers, enemies, objects. His hatred for women began to harden into something lethal. As the marriage disintegrated, Speck drifted further. He bounced from job to job: construction, dock work, odd labor, but he never lasted long. Employers described him as unreliable, often drunk, prone to sudden bursts of temper. He carried knives everywhere, as though preparing for a fight that never ended. The tattoos on his arms, inked during drunken sprees, told their own story. Among them, one stood out like a prophecy: born to raise hell. The truth is, Speck was already lost. Every day, he sank deeper into the shadows. Alcohol numbed him, violence defined him, and failure followed him like a curse. But what made him truly dangerous was not just his rage, it was his emptiness. A hollow man who felt nothing, cared for nothing, believed in nothing. Richard Speck wasn't just a criminal, he was a storm waiting to break. And in the summer of 1966, Chicago would be the city where that storm unleashed its fury. By the mid-1960s, Richard Speck was drifting on the edges of society like a shadow no one wanted to acknowledge. His short-lived marriage to Shirley Malone had ended in bitter divorce, leaving him without a family, without purpose, and without control. He had become exactly what his tattoos proclaimed: a man born to raise hell. At first, his life seemed to settle into a rhythm of failure. He wandered from one job to another, always fired for drunkenness or violence. He tried his hand at carpentry, dock work, even as a painter. But the results were always the same: too much booze, too many fights, too much rage. He had the hands of a worker, rough and scarred, but his spirit was poisoned. Employers whispered that he was unpredictable, and neighbors spoke of him as a man you cross the street to avoid. For a time, he tried to return to some semblance of normalcy through his connections to the merchant seaman trade. The docks of Chicago and the Gulf of Mexico offered work for men like him: hard, dirty, dangerous jobs aboard ships where alcohol flowed as freely as seawater. Speck took assignments when he could, but even there, his violence burned bridges. He was a drunk who could not be trusted, a knife fighter always one drink away from trouble. But it wasn't just work that fell apart. Women, too, began to fear him. After Shirley left, he spiraled into a bitter hatred of women, seeing in them both the source of his humiliation and the target for his vengeance. His words were laced with venom whenever he spoke of them. In bars, he became the kind of man who drank until his hands shook, then turned to whoever was nearest, often women, to spill his anger. And yet, there was something more terrifying beneath it all: the growing sense that Speck no longer cared about consequences. Petty thefts and drunken assaults no longer satisfied the rage inside him. He wanted more, though he couldn't have explained it if asked. It was as if violence itself had become his only way of feeling alive. By 1966, Speck was a man with no attachments, no family, and no anchor. His ex-wife had taken his daughter. His mother was distant, his stepfather still cruel. He was a drifter with a record as long as his arm, living from bottle to bottle, couch to couch, job to job. The city of Chicago became his stage, its dark taverns and dockside streets, the backdrop for his steady descent into oblivion. But oblivion would not have him yet. Fate had something else waiting. Within weeks, his restlessness, his rage, and his lust for destruction would converge in a single night that would forever change the history of American crime. Richard Speck was no longer just a failure, no longer just a drunk. He was becoming a predator, and predators eventually find prey. By early 1966, Richard Speck had become a ghost drifting between bars, cheap hotels, and dockside flophouses. His marriage was gone, his jobs were gone, and with each passing day, so was his grip on any semblance of humanity. It was then that Chicago, already a city, simmering with unrest, corruption, and crime would become his new hunting ground. Chicago in the 1960s was a city of contradictions. By day, the skyline glistened with ambition still towers rising higher each year, a symbol of progress. By night, however, the underbelly revealed itself. Smoky taverns where men drank until dawn, neon signs buzzing outside strip clubs, alleys where shadows lingered longer than they should. The city was alive with music, laughter, and commerce, but underneath it all, there was tension. Organized crime still had its grip. Street violence was common. Women walking alone were warned to keep their purses close, their eyes sharper. Into this world stepped Richard Speck, a man who seemed born for the city's darker side. He rented rooms in shabby hotels, drifted through taverns near the docks, and picked up work sporadically as a merchant seaman. But every job ended the same: drunken fights, reckless behavior, or simply walking away without warning. Ship captains and union bosses began to recognize him, not as a worker, but as trouble, a man who carried knives, drank himself into oblivion, and bragged about his capacity for violence. It was during this time that Speck began to haunt the taverns of East Chicago, Hammond, and Calumet City. Bartenders remembered his piercing stare, the way he sat alone nursing drink after drink, muttering to himself. He stood out not because of charisma, but because of the aura of danger that clung to him. He was tall, lanky, with a face hardened by alcohol and failure, and a tattoo scrawled across his arm like a threat. Born to raise hell, women who crossed his path often remembered the same details: his stares that lingered too long, his crude remarks, the smell of whiskey on his breath. He was a man who seemed both desperate and menacing, always watching, always prowling. Though no one could have known then, Speck was rehearsing in those moments, practicing intimidation, feeding the hatred growing inside him, and it was hatred that defined him. Hatred for his ex-wife, hatred for women who rejected him, hatred for bosses who fired him, for police who arrested him, for a world that had no place for him. That hatred had become a furnace, and by the summer of 1966, it was ready to burst into flame. Chicago would soon learn that Richard Speck was not just another drunk in a tavern. He was a storm-gathering force, waiting for the night when he would unleash horrors the city had never seen before. And when he finally did, it would not be random. It would be a performance of rage, played out in a house full of women who had never harmed him, but who would become his chosen victims. By the time spring bled into the summer of 1966, Richard Speck had become a fixture of Chicago's shadows, a man people noticed but avoided. Like a stray dog with a mean streak, he wasn't just a drifter anymore. He was a walking red flag. Arrests piled up like discarded bottles, disorderly conduct, assault, theft. His reputation preceded him everywhere he went. Neighbors recalled the way he carried himself, always with a swagger that wasn't confidence, but defiance. He walked with his chest forward, eyes scanning like he was daring the world to challenge him. And always, there was a knife. He carried them habitually, sometimes tucked in his boots, sometimes slipped into his belt. The cold steel, his constant companion. For Speck, a blade wasn't just protection, it was a promise, a way to ensure that every confrontation ended his way. But it wasn't just the weapons. His instability seeped out in everyday life. He would drink until he was incoherent, then explode over the smallest insult. In one tavern, a simple bump from another patron led to Speck smashing a beer bottle and lunging forward, eyes wild with fury. In another incident, he beat a man nearly unconscious for speaking to a woman he had been eyeing. Two strangers, these were terrifying flashes of violence. To Speck, they were routine. Police officers who dealt with him described him as unpredictable sometimes, silent and withdrawn, sometimes loud and aggressive. One officer recalled that when Speck was booked, he would mutter darkly to himself, as if rehearsing arguments no one else could hear. Jail cells became revolving doors for him. In, out, in again. And each time he emerged, he seemed just a little more hollow, a little more dangerous. What unnerved people most was the duality. At times, Speck could appear almost shy, soft-spoken, even polite. He would mumble apologies, keep his eyes lowered, give the impression of a man beaten down by life. But this was a masking, fragile, ready to crack the moment he felt challenged. Behind it seethed resentment, paranoia, and a violence he could barely contain. Those around him began to sense something was off, something beyond the ordinary troubles of a drunk or a petty criminal. It was in the way he stared too long, in the sudden shifts from silence to rage, in the way his presence seemed to drain the air from a room. He wasn't just a man spiraling, he was a man radiating danger. And yet, the city barely noticed. Chicago was full of men like Richard Speck, drunks, criminals, failures. No one realized that this particular man was different, that his instability was not just self-destruction, but a fuse already burning. Soon, the violence that had been contained to bars and back alleys would burst into something larger, something that would stain the entire city in blood. Richard Speck was no longer just dangerous to himself, he was about to become dangerous to everyone. July 13, 1966, the night that would burn Richard Speck's name into infamy, began like so many others, with alcohol. He spent the day drifting through Chicago's taverns, his skin sticky from the summer heat, his mind clouded with whiskey and bitterness. Patrons later remembered him moving from bar to bar, the Shipyard Inn, the Checkered Flag, dingy watering holes where lost men gathered. He was restless, muttering about women, about his bad luck, about jobs he couldn't hold. He carried himself like a man on the verge of something, pacing, drinking, glaring. He had tried to find work on the docks earlier that week, flashing his seaman's papers and begging for assignments. But rejection followed him. He was turned away, left humiliated once again. The rejection stoked his anger until it swelled into something he could no longer contain. To Speck, the world had mocked him, denied him, pushed him aside, and now he wanted to push back. As night fell, the alcohol worked its way deeper into his veins. Witnesses said he became louder, more aggressive, pounding his glass against the counter, his words slurred with menace. He spoke of women with a venom that unsettled even the hardened drinkers around him. His hands shook not from fear but from anticipation, like a predator circling prey it had not yet chosen. By late evening, Speck drifted out into the humid Chicago streets. The neon lights of taverns glowed behind him as he walked aimlessly, the city buzzing with music, traffic, and the occasional siren. Somewhere along that walk, his anger crystallized into decision. He would break into a house. He would take what he wanted, and if anyone stood in his way, he had his knives. But it wasn't robbery that filled his thoughts. It was domination, control, a way to unleash everything bottled up inside him. And in that haze of alcohol and fury, his path led him to a quiet neighborhood on the far south side, a place where the air was still, where the streets were lined with modest houses, and where no one imagined that a nightmare could suddenly descend upon them. Richard Speck, with nothing left to lose, walked into that neighborhood like a storm rolling over a sleeping town. His target was not yet chosen, but soon, fate would place him before a house full of young women whose only crime was being in his path. The stage was set, the city unaware, the night heavy with the promise of violence, and as midnight crept closer, Speck's fury hardened into action. He would not leave the night without blood. At 2319 East 100th Street stood a modest townhouse, unremarkable from the outside, nestled in a quiet neighborhood of South Chicago. It was the kind of house you'd pass without a second glance: a brick facade, trimmed hedges, a small porch, but inside, it was filled with life, laughter, and the hum of youthful ambition. This was the dormitory for a group of student nurses from the South Chicago Community Hospital, most of them young women from the Philippines who had come to America with hope in their hearts and stethoscopes in their future. On the evening of July 13th, the townhouse glowed with a gentle warmth. The nurses were winding down from their long shifts at the hospital. Some were chatting in the living room, sipping tea, sharing stories of their patients. Others were preparing for bed, folding laundry, writing letters home to families thousands of miles away. They spoke of missing their loved ones, of dreams for their careers, of small joys like music and shared meals. It was a safe space, a sisterhood far from home. The women who lived there were vibrant, intelligent, and full of promise. Gloria, who dreamed of becoming a surgical nurse; Valentina, known for her soft singing voice as she cooked; Merlita, always smiling, who wrote daily letters to her parents; and Corazon Amaro, shy but determined, who often stayed up late studying in her room. Each one carried a story, a future. But outside, The air was thick with something else. In the shadows, Richard Speck prowled closer. The modest dormitory, lit softly from within, seemed to him a beacon. To Speck, drunk and brimming with rage, it wasn't a home, it was an opportunity. He saw not 8 hardworking young women, but victims. He saw a chance to feed his hunger for control, to unleash the violence boiling inside him. The house was unlocked. Safety in that neighborhood had always been taken for granted. No bars on the windows, no chains on the doors. After all, what danger could possibly come for a group of nurses devoted to saving lives? They were women of healing, not war. They were caretakers, not soldiers. Who would ever imagine that death itself might walk quietly through their front door? As the night deepened and the city outside settled into uneasy slumber, the atmosphere inside the townhouse remained calm. The women spoke in hushed tones, laughter fading into yawns, one by one retreating to their rooms. But unknown to them, a shadow was moving closer, steps deliberate, breath unsteady, a knife glinting faintly in the dark. The dormitory at 2319 East 100th Street was about to transform from a sanctuary of dreams to a chamber of horror, and by dawn, it would be remembered not for the lives it sheltered, but for the lives it lost. It was just past midnight when Richard Speck made his move. The humid air clung to him as he approached the nurse's townhouse at 2319 East 100th Street. The neighborhood was still, windows dark, the kind of silence that suggested safety, but Speck carried chaos with him, a knife in his pocket, alcohol coursing through his veins, and fury burning behind his eyes. He was not looking for money or shelter. He was looking to dominate. The door was unlocked. In a cruel twist of fate, the nurses hadn't bothered to secure it. Why would they? This was a house filled with women who worked long hours healing others. They were exhausted, trusting of their neighborhood, innocent in their belief that danger belonged to other parts of the city. Speck slipped inside like a shadow crossing the threshold. The house was quiet. A few soft murmurs drifted from upstairs, women settling into bed, pages of books turning, the faint hum of a radio. Speck moved carefully at first, his lanky frame blending into the dark. But soon, the knife was in his hand, and his intent no longer hidden. The first nurse to encounter him was startled, confused by the stranger in their home. But before she could scream, the knife flashed, his voice a low growl ordering silence. Fear spread quickly through the house as Speck forced the women together at knife point. Imagine the shock. One moment safe in their home, the next confronted by a wild-eyed intruder reeking of alcohol, brandishing cold steel, demanding control. One by one, he corralled them, binding their wrists, silencing their cries. The women, though terrified, complied, believing perhaps it was a robbery, that if they obeyed, he might leave them alive. Their medical training had taught them to manage crises, to protect others. But nothing had prepared them for this. Being trapped in their own home, helpless before a man who seemed less human than beast, the air thickened with dread as more of the nurses awoke, each pulled into the nightmare. 8 women now stood before him, their eyes wide with terror, their futures dangling by a thread. Speck held all the power, and he savored it. He wasn't in a rush. He wasn't simply taking money or valuables. He was orchestrating fear, savoring the helplessness of his captives. In that moment, the house was no longer a dormitory. It was his domain. The women, once healers, once filled with dreams, were reduced to trembling figures, bound together under the cruel authority of a single man. And for Richard Speck, that was exactly what he wanted. To be in control, to make the world feel the chaos that consumed him. The invasion was complete. What began as an ordinary night had turned into a scene of unimaginable terror. And for the nurses, the nightmare had only just begun. The atmosphere inside the townhouse shifted from quiet, dread, to a suffocating terror as Richard Speck took command of the nurses. 8 young women, bound together by fear, stood or sat in the living room, while the lanky intruder loomed over them, knife glinting in the dim light. He barked orders in a low, slurred voice, his tone swinging wildly between cold precision and drunken rage. For the women, time began to fracture. Seconds stretched into hours, each heartbeat loud in their ears as they tried to make sense of what was happening. Some prayed silently, others tried to comfort one another with trembling whispers. Their minds raced with the same desperate question. Was this a robbery? Would he leave if they cooperated? Speck played with that uncertainty. He moved deliberately, not like a thief in a hurry, but like a predator savoring the moment. He tied their wrists, forced them to sit in silence, and paced the room as though deciding their fate. Every scrape of his boot against the floor, every flick of his knife sent waves of panic through the women. The house, once their sanctuary, had become a cage. And yet, amidst their terror, a strange kind of hope lingered. Maybe he only wanted money. Maybe he would take what he needed and disappear into the night. They tried to cling to that thought. But deep down, something darker pressed in the realization that this was not about money at all. This was about control. One by one, he called them into separate rooms. The silence that followed each departure was unbearable. Those left behind sat frozen, staring at the doorway, waiting for their friends to return. But no one came back. Only Speck returned, his face empty, his breathing heavy, his knife still in hand. Then he would choose again. Another name, another trembling woman led away, another door closing. The nurses began to understand the horror. They were not simply being robbed. They were being chosen, one after another, for something far worse. Their whispered prayers turned into muffled sobs, their hope replaced by resignation. For Speck, it was all about power. He controlled when they moved, when they spoke, even how they breathed. He drew out the night not because he needed to but because he wanted to savor the fear in their eyes. He wanted them to know they were helpless, that their lives were his to take. And so, the night stretched on, each moment darker than the last. In the quiet streets outside, Chicago slept peacefully, unaware that inside this small brick townhouse, 8 futures were being extinguished one by one under the reign of a single man's cruelty. The killing began slowly, almost ritualistically, as if Richard Speck was working through some twisted plan that only he understood. One by one, he led the nurses into separate rooms, isolating them from the others. For those left behind, the silence that followed was unbearable, the sound of doors closing, footsteps fading, then nothing. Minutes ticked by like hours until Speck returned, breathing heavier, his knife still in hand, and his eyes colder than before. Then he would select the next victim. The women clung to each other, whispering prayers, sobbing quietly, their minds trapped between hope and horror. Perhaps the others were alive. Perhaps he was only frightening them. But the truth revealed itself too quickly. When he returned without them, when he refused to answer their desperate pleas, dread hardened into certainty. He was killing them. Speck's methods were as brutal as they were varied. Some were strangled, others stabbed, some suffocated with pillows. The violence was intimate. He killed with his hands, his blade, his breath. It wasn't efficiency he sought. It was domination. He wanted to feel their struggles end beneath his grip. The women fought for their lives, but bound, outnumbered, and terrified. They stood no chance against the predator who moved through their home like a reaper. The killings were not quick. They stretched across the long, suffocating hours of the night. Each time Speck re-entered the living room, the number of women diminished, their courage fraying as they realized there would be no mercy, no escape. For those still waiting, the fear was worse than death itself. The anticipation, the sound of footsteps approaching, the knowledge that their turn was coming. And yet, in that sea of terror, something remarkable occurred. Amidst the screams and the silences, amidst the steady thinning of their numbers, one young nurse found the instinct to survive. Corazón amurao, trembling and desperate, slipped beneath a bed as Speck's attention turned elsewhere. She pressed herself into the darkness, barely daring to breathe, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure he would hear it. From her hiding place, she listened helpless, horrified as the murders continued around her. Imagine the courage it took to remain silent, to resist the primal urge to flee, to endure the sounds of your friends being slaughtered, while you lay frozen in the shadows. For hours, Corazon became both witness and survivor, trapped between despair and the will to live. By the time the sun began to edge over the horizon on July 14th, the dormitory had been transformed into a house of the dead. 8 young women, each with dreams of healing, of building lives, lay lifeless. And only one survivor remained, hidden, trembling, her body stiff with fear. Speck, having extinguished nearly every light in that house, slipped away into the morning, leaving behind silence, horror, and the legacy of one of the most infamous massacres in American history. The silence that followed Richard Speck's departure was deafening. Inside the bloodstained townhouse at 2319 East 100th Street, only one heart still pounded with life, a heart that had beaten through hours of terror, refusing to stop. Hidden beneath a bed, wedged tightly in the shadows, Corazon Amaro lay stiff and trembling. For what felt like an eternity, she had listened to the nightmare unfold, the muffled cries of her friends, the sounds of struggle, the sudden silences. She had counted each return of Speck's heavy footsteps, knowing they meant another soul had been chosen. And yet, she remained undetected. Corazon's survival was not luck alone. It was the sheer force of her will. She pressed herself flat against the floor, hardly daring to breathe. Her muscles cramped, her chest burned, and her mind screamed for release. But she resisted every instinct to move. One sound, one whimper, could have betrayed her. The image of his knife, the memory of his breath on her skin, kept her frozen in place. When Speck finally slipped away into the dawn, Corazon did not move. Fear convinced her he might return, that perhaps he was still there, waiting. So she lay there for hours more, her ears straining to catch even the faintest noise, her eyes wide in the dark. Time became meaningless. Every second stretched into eternity, until the silence itself seemed unbearable. It was only when daylight fully poured through the windows, when the world outside began to stir with the ordinary sounds of morning birds calling, cars passing, that she dared to emerge. Her body shook violently as she crawled out from under the bed. What she saw would haunt her forever. The house was a tomb. The women she had laughed with only hours earlier now lay lifeless, their dreams extinguished in the cruelest way imaginable. Gloria, Valentina, Merlita, each face frozen in terror, each body broken by violence. 8 young nurses murdered in cold blood. Corazon stumbled through the carnage, her voice trapped in her throat, her vision blurred with tears. Somehow, through the haze of shock, she forced herself to move. Barefoot, still bound in fear, she pushed open a window and climbed out onto the narrow ledge of the dormitory. Her hands gripped the ledge as if clinging to life itself. Below, the city stirred, unaware of the horror inside. When neighbors spotted her, pale, shaking eyes wide with terror, they rushed to her aid. Words tumbled out of her mouth in gasps. "All my friends are dead." It was a cry that would ripple through Chicago, a sentence that transformed an ordinary summer morning into a day carved in history. Corazon Amaro had survived the night Richard Speck tried to erase her, and because of her, the world would know what had happened in that house of healing turned house of death. The morning of July 14, 1966, began like any other on Chicago's South Side, humid, sticky, and already humming with the sounds of a city waking. But at 2319 East 100th Street, the silence was unnatural, a stillness heavy with death. When police officers arrived, alerted by neighbors who had seen a terrified young woman climbing from the window ledge, they stepped into what would later be described as one of the most horrific crime scenes in American history. The first thing they noticed was the smell of thick, metallic stench that clung to the air. Inside the modest brick townhouse, order had collapsed into chaos. Furniture was overturned, sheets stained dark, and silence hung like a shroud. The officers moved slowly, weapons drawn, every nerve tense as they braced themselves for what they might find. Room by room, the horror revealed itself. Bodies lay where Speck had left them, bound, bruised, strangled, stabbed. 8 young women, once vibrant with laughter and hope, were now still, their lives extinguished in the most brutal fashion imaginable. The image of them lying together in death, some in their beds, others on the floor, would stay with every man who entered that house until their dying day. Hardened detectives, men who had seen shootings, gangland murders, suicides, wept openly. In the midst of the carnage stood one miracle. Corazon Amaro, the lone survivor, trembling as she told her story. She spoke in broken whispers of the man who had come in the night, the knife, the bindings, the way her friends were taken one by one and never returned. Her voice cracked with guilt as she described how she had hidden, how she had listened in silence while her friends suffered. The officers reassured her again, and again she was not to blame. She was alive, and her courage had given them the key to finding the monster responsible. News of the massacre spread through Chicago like wildfire. Radios crackled with bulletins. Newspapers rushed out special editions with headlines that screamed of horror. 8 nurses slain. Crowds gathered outside the dormitory, their faces pale, eyes wide in disbelief. Parents clutched their daughters tighter. Hospitals filled with whispers of fear. In a city already bruised by violence and unrest, this crime was something different, something that pierced to the heart of every home. The image of the 8 nurses, murdered in their own home, was almost too much to comprehend. These were not gangsters, not rivals in some underworld feud. They were healers. They had crossed oceans to dedicate their lives to saving others. And in one night, their lives had been stolen by a stranger whose only motive was hatred and domination. For Chicago, it was a wound that would not close. For America, it was a story that seemed almost unbelievable in its cruelty. And for police, it was the beginning of one of the largest manhunts the city had ever seen. Richard Speck had vanished into the streets, leaving behind only carnage and a single witness. But the city was about to rise against him. The hunt for the monster had begun. Chicago erupted in fear. The morning after the murders, every newspaper headline screamed the same word: massacre. 8 nurses slaughtered in their own home. The details leaked into the public consciousness like poison. A stranger breaking in, binding them, killing them one by one. For a city already accustomed to crime, this was different. This was evil without reason, violence without purpose. The South Side turned into a fortress overnight. Doors that had never been locked before were bolted shut. Parents warned their daughters not to go out after dark. Hospitals once seen as sanctuaries of safety suddenly felt vulnerable. If a group of nurses could be wiped out in one night, who was safe? Fear did not whisper. It screamed. Police threw everything they had into the hunt. Detectives combed through taverns, flophouses, and seedy motels, asking questions, flashing photos, chasing leads. They knew the killer was dangerous, unpredictable, and still somewhere in their city. The description from survivor Corazon Amaro gave them their first weapon, a face. She described a tall, lanky white man with pockmarked skin and a tattoo that seemed to sear itself into memory. Born to raise hell. That detail alone was unforgettable, like a confession carved into his flesh. The public devoured every report. Sketches of the suspect appeared in newspapers and on television. People studied them carefully, wondering if the man lived next door, if he sat beside them on the bus, if he passed them on the street. Sightings poured in, but none stuck. Each lead was a dead end. Each day that passed made the city more tense. Meanwhile, Richard Speck was a ghost, drifting through the city he had just scarred. He moved between cheap hotels and flophouses, blending into the shadows, drinking heavily, muttering to himself. His appearance was ordinary enough that he could disappear into a crowd, but his mind was unraveling. He read the headlines about himself. He saw the wanted posters. He knew the city was hunting him, and yet he didn't run far. He stayed in Chicago, as if daring the city to catch him. For detectives, the pressure was unbearable. The mayor demanded answers. Reporters crowded police stations. Families of the victims demanded justice. Every hour without an arrest deepened the wound. The people wanted the monster caged, and the city's reputation demanded it. And so, the manhunt swelled. Hundreds of officers, endless interviews, the largest search the city had seen in years. But for days, Speck slipped through their fingers, vanishing into the underbelly of Chicago, where drifters and lost souls lived nameless, faceless lives. The city waited in terror. The police hunted in desperation, and somewhere in a dingy room, the killer of 8 nurses drank, muttered, and wondered how much longer he could run before fate closed its fist around him. For 4 days, Richard Speck drifted like a shadow through Chicago, his body fueled by alcohol and his mind unraveling under the weight of his crimes. He slipped into flophouses along Skid Row, the kind of places where the hopeless went to rot dirty mattresses, cockroaches crawling across peeling wallpaper, the air thick with sweat and despair. No one asked questions in those rooms. Men came and went, often drunk, often nameless. To Speck, it was the perfect place to disappear. But hiding did not bring peace. He read the newspapers obsessively, staring at his own face on wanted posters, on headlines that screamed mass murderer. He knew the entire city was hunting him. Each time he caught his reflection in a cracked mirror, he saw not a man, but the monster the world now knew him to be. The walls closed in tighter each day. He drank more, mumbled to himself, lashed out at shadows. Even among other drifters, he stood apart, a man consumed by paranoia and despair. By July 17th, Speck had reached his breaking point. Alone in his rented room at the Star Hotel, he stared at his arms at the words "Born to Raise Hell" inked forever into his skin. He no longer felt like a man with options. The city was hunting him. The police were closing in, and deep inside, some part of him must have known there would be no escape. That night, he made his choice. He broke a glass, took the jagged shard in his trembling hands, and slashed at his wrists and arms. Blood spilled across the dirty sheets, pooling beneath him. He collapsed onto the bed, convinced his story was ending there in a cheap hotel room, his crimes buried with him in silence. But fate was not finished with Richard Speck. His moans of pain carried through the thin walls, and a hotel employee, suspicious of the noise, forced his way inside. What he found was Speck, pale and bleeding, barely conscious, his arms shredded with cuts. An ambulance was called. He was rushed to Cook County Hospital, his body still clinging to life. It was an almost poetic irony. The man who had slaughtered 8 nurses in cold blood was now being saved by doctors and nurses. He had murdered healers, and now healers fought to keep him alive. Speck, even in his failure to die, could not escape the cruel weight of his story. The manhunt was about to end not in a blaze of police gunfire, but in the sterile fluorescent-lit hallways of a hospital. The monster was bleeding, but he was not yet caged, and soon, fate would put him face to face with the justice he had so far evaded. At Cook County Hospital, Richard Speck lay on a gurney, pale and weak, his arms crudely bandaged where he had slashed himself. The doctors and nurses worked quickly, their hands steady, their focus entirely on keeping him alive. They did not yet know who he was. To them, he was just another broken man from the streets, another drunk who had tried and failed to escape his misery. But fate has a way of placing the right eyes in the right place at the right time. Among the staff was a young surgical resident, Dr. Leroy Smith. As he moved past Speck's stretcher, something caught his attention. A tattoo. 3 words etched crudely into the skin of the man's forearm. Born to raise hell. The words were infamous already. Survivor Corazon Amaro had whispered them to detectives in her trembling testimony. Newspapers had printed it. Posters had repeated it. That tattoo was as much a signature as a fingerprint. And now, here it was, in living flesh. Dr. Smith froze, staring at the ink. His heart pounded. He glanced at the man's face, gaunt, pockmarked, glassy-eyed. Could it be? Could the man lying on his stretcher, half dead from self-inflicted wounds, be the most wanted man in America? Without hesitation, he alerted the police. Officers stormed into the hospital, their eyes widening as they, too, recognized the man. It was him. After days of searching, after a city held hostage by fear, the monster had been delivered into their hands, not by their manhunt, but by his own collapse. Richard Speck was officially under arrest. His attempted suicide had failed, and now his life would belong to the courts, to the state, to history. The irony was brutal. The man who had slaughtered 8 nurses in cold blood was captured not in a blaze of police glory, but by the very kind of people he hated, by doctors and nurses, the healers whose lives he had sought to destroy. They saved him so that justice could claim him. The city breathed a sigh of relief. The newspapers erupted with new headlines. Nurse killer caught. Crowds gathered outside the hospital and the police station, staring with disgust and rage as Speck was transferred under heavy guard. No longer a shadow, no longer a ghost, he was flesh and blood, caged and exposed. For the families of the victims, it was not closure. Nothing could undo what had been done. But it was justice beginning to take shape. The monster had been found, and the world was about to look him in the eye. Richard Speck would now stand trial, and the horrors of that July night would be replayed in the cold light of a courtroom. The survivor would face him, the city would face him, and the world would see if a man who had shown no mercy would now beg for it. The trial of Richard Speck began in April 1967, less than a year after the night of terror that had gripped Chicago. From the moment he entered the courtroom, the atmosphere was charged. People packed the gallery, desperate to see the man whose name had become synonymous with evil. Reporters filled every seat, their pens scratching furiously, cameras flashing whenever the jury wasn't looking. The whole world wanted to know, what kind of man could slaughter 8 women in one night? Speck sat before them, thin, expressionless, his pockmarked face a mask. He wore a plain suit, his hair combed back, the infamous Born to Raise Hell tattoo covered beneath his sleeve. There was no remorse in his eyes, no trace of guilt. He appeared calm, almost indifferent, as though the entire proceeding were a nuisance rather than a reckoning. But then came the moment that would sear itself into history. When survivor Corazon Amaro took the stand, the courtroom fell into silence. Small, trembling but resolute, she described the horror of that night in painstaking detail. Her voice cracked as she recounted how Speck had bound them, how he led her friends one by one into the next room, how she hid beneath the bed while he slaughtered them. She spoke of the silence that followed each scream, of the unbearable weight, of the courage it took not to move, not to breathe. And then, when asked if she could identify the man who had done this, Corazon turned, pointed her finger across the courtroom, and said the words that froze every soul present. That man, Richard Speck. Speck did not flinch. He did not look away. He simply stared back at her, his face unreadable, as though her words carried no weight. But for the jury, for the families, for the city of Chicago, it was enough. The survivor had named the monster, and the walls of the courtroom shook with the force of truth. The prosecution built its case meticulously. Corazon's testimony, Speck's fingerprints inside the house, his own admissions of being in the neighborhood that night. Piece by piece, the picture was clear. The defense, scrambling, tried to paint him as mentally unstable, incapable of controlling his actions. They spoke of his childhood trauma, his alcoholism, his brain injuries, but none of it mattered. The evidence was overwhelming, the horror undeniable. Every day of the trial, crowds outside shouted for justice. Inside, jurors sat pale-faced as they heard details too gruesome to forget. One juror later confessed that the images haunted him long after the trial was over. On April 15, 1967, after less than 50 minutes of deliberation, the jury delivered its verdict, guilty of murder on all 8 counts. The sentence, death in the electric chair. The courtroom erupted. For the families, it was a moment of vindication. For Chicago, it was a balm for the wound that had festered since July, and for Richard Speck, it was the end of his charade as a drifter in the shadows. He was now branded for what he truly was, a mass murderer, condemned by the very society he had sought to terrorize. But fate, as always, had its own cruel twists in store. The death sentence would not be the end of Richard Speck. When the trial ended and the gavel came down with the weight of a death sentence, many believed Richard Speck's story would close swiftly in the electric chair. But the man himself showed no fear, no remorse, no trace of humanity. In fact, his behavior in the courtroom became one of the most chilling aspects of the entire case. Reporters described him as detached, almost bored. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was in short, flat sentences, delivered without emotion. Sometimes he smirked, as though amused by the proceedings, as though the trial was less about his crimes and more about the spectacle it created. He sat slouched, hands folded, staring blankly at the ceiling or at nothing at all, while the families of the women he murdered wept only feet away. Psychologists who examined him were baffled. He did not fit the mold of a typical criminal. He wasn't insane in the clinical sense. He understood what he had done, but he displayed something perhaps more terrifying: complete indifference. The lives of 8 women had ended by his hand, and yet he carried himself as though it were all meaningless, as though he had stepped on ants. When asked later how he felt about the murders, Speck's responses were cryptic and cold. One psychiatrist recalled him saying simply, "It just wasn't their night." Another time, he shrugged, saying, "They were women. They were bound to die anyway." These words confirmed what many feared Richard. Speck did not see people as human. He saw them as objects, disposable, existing only to absorb his rage. The public was horrified by this lack of remorse. Newspapers splashed his dead-eyed photos across their pages, calling him the Mad Killer and the Butcher of Chicago. For many, the trial revealed not just a man who committed murder, but a man without a soul. Even hardened police officers admitted that looking into his eyes gave them chills, eyes empty of compassion, filled only with void. And yet, Speck thrived on the attention. Though he never admitted it outright, his smirks, his calm demeanor, suggested he liked being the center of a nightmare. He enjoyed the power of being feared, of knowing his name would live on in infamy. For a drifter who had once been invisible, overlooked, and discarded, this was his twisted form of immortality. The court had branded him guilty. The jury had sentenced him to death. But in those moments, Richard Speck seemed to wear it like a crown. He was no longer just a man. He had become a symbol of terror, and he relished it. But justice, as it often does in America, is never simple. The death sentence handed to Richard Speck would soon be tangled in legal battles, delays, and a Supreme Court ruling that would alter his fate. The monster was caged, but he was not finished. Richard Speck's fate seemed sealed on April 15, 1967, when the jury sentenced him to die in the electric chair. For many in Chicago, it felt like justice delivered. The image of him strapped to that chair, his smirk wiped away by a surge of electricity, seemed the only fitting end for a man who had stolen 8 lives without a flicker of remorse. Families of the victims clung to that thought, hoping the nightmare would end with his execution. But fate is rarely that simple. And in America, the law often twists in ways the public does not expect. While Speck sat on death row at Joliet State Prison, appeals began. His lawyers argued that errors had been made during jury selection, that pre-trial publicity had tainted the case. At first, these challenges failed. The people of Chicago felt confident they would soon be rid of him. Then came 1972, a year that shook the entire American justice system. The U.S. Supreme Court, in the landmark Furman v. Georgia decision, declared the death penalty unconstitutional as it was being applied at the time. Overnight, hundreds of death sentences across the country were commuted to life in prison. Among them was Richard Speck. The reaction in Chicago was explosive. Families of the slain nurses wept with rage. Headlines screamed of injustice. Citizens demanded to know how a man who had slaughtered 8 women could now be spared. For many, it was a betrayal, a reopening of wounds they had struggled to close. Speck himself, he hardly blinked. When told his death sentence had been overturned, he gave no expression of relief, no gratitude. He simply accepted it, as if he had expected fate to bend in his favor. To him, life in prison was not punishment. It was merely existence continued, a stage upon which his darkness could play on. The state resentenced him in 1972 to 400 to 1,200 years in prison. Effectively, a life sentence with no hope of parole. Judge Richard Fitzgerald, who presided over the resentencing, said plainly that Speck should never again walk free. It was as close to the death penalty as the law would allow. And so Speck's story shifted. No longer the condemned awaiting execution, he became something else, a caged predator, a reminder of evil that the world could not erase. Joliet would be his new stage, and over the coming years, rumors from inside those prison walls would paint a picture just as grotesque as the night of July 1966. The electric chair had been denied him, but the cage would not silence him. Richard Speck's infamy was only beginning to mutate. Life in prison did not tame Richard Speck, it distorted him further. Behind the walls of Joliet and later Stateville Penitentiary, he became less a prisoner than a spectacle. Guards, fellow inmates, even journalists who glimpsed him over the years described the same thing. A man who seemed to thrive in the chaos of confinement, who found new ways to disturb and disgust long after his trial was over. Drugs became his lifeblood. Inside the prison, smuggling was rampant, and Speck dove headfirst into the black market. He traded favors, manipulated other inmates, and quickly gained access to pills, marijuana, and heroin. In photographs smuggled out, he looked less like a man serving a sentence than one drowning himself in intoxication. Eyes glazed, grin wide. But it was not just drugs. In the twisted ecosystem of prison, Speck became something more bizarre, something grotesque. Inmates whispered of his sexual relationships, of how he allowed himself to be used in exchange for drugs, of how he blurred every line between predator and victim. In the late 1980s, a video surfaced that shocked the world. Richard Speck in prison, snorting cocaine, parading around in women's lingerie, his chest swollen from smuggled hormones. The tape, secretly recorded and later leaked to television in 1996, showed Speck with painted fingernails, speaking casually about the murders that had made him infamous. At one point, he looked directly into the camera and said, "If they only knew how much fun I was having, they'd turn me loose." It was a confession not just of indulgence, but of triumph. Even locked away for life, Speck had found a way to revel in corruption, to turn his punishment into a stage. The world recoiled. Families of the victims wept anew. Viewers sat in stunned silence, watching the killer of 8 nurses boast and smirk as if prison were a playground. Journalists and psychologists debated endlessly. Was this Speck's true self, finally unmasked? Or was it another performance, designed to shock and horrify? Either way, the video confirmed what many already suspected. Richard Speck never felt remorse. He never regretted what he had done. His only satisfaction came from knowing he could still disturb, still disgust, still hold power over those who remembered his crimes. In prison, Richard Speck was not forgotten. He became a living ghost, a reminder that some evils cannot be buried, only contained. For nearly 25 years, he haunted Illinois' prison system, his presence a dark scar that refused to fade. But time, even for monsters, eventually runs out. And for Speck, the end would come not with violence, but with something far more ordinary. On December 5, 1991, the final chapter of Richard Speck's life came quietly, almost in the early morning hours. Prison staff at Stateville Penitentiary found him collapsed, struggling to breathe. For years, his body had been ravaged by drugs, alcohol, and neglect. He was bloated, weak, his veins scarred from years of abuse. At just 49 years old, Speck's health resembled that of a man decades older. The official cause was a massive heart attack. There was no knife, no courtroom, no blaze of violence, only the quiet wheeze of a failing body giving out for the man who had drenched a Chicago townhouse in blood. Death came not as punishment, but as inevitability. News of his death spread quickly, and the reaction was as cold as the man himself had always been. There were no mourners, no vigils, no grieving crowds. No family members stepped forward to claim his body. To many, he had ceased to be human long before. The world greeted his death with relief, even satisfaction. He was gone. His remains were cremated in secrecy, the ashes scattered in an undisclosed location. Prison officials refused to reveal where, fearing that a grave might become either a shrine for the disturbed or a target for desecration. In the end, Richard Speck vanished from the earth the way society wished he had years earlier, erased, discarded, forgotten in the physical sense. But the irony was sharp. His death brought no closure. The families of the 8 nurses still carried their grief, their wounds never truly healing. Survivors like Corazon Amaro, who had lived with the memory of his voice, his footsteps, his knife for decades, did not find peace in the news. Justice had never felt enough. And yet, his passing closed a chapter. The name Richard Speck, once shouted in fear on Chicago's streets, became a cautionary whisper in the annals of true crime. He died as he lived, alone, despised, empty. If there was one thing his death proved, it was this: even monsters cannot outrun time. Their cruelty may echo through history, but their bodies, like everyone else's, eventually rot and return to dust. For Richard Speck, the end was not a fiery spectacle. It was silence. And in that silence, perhaps, the world could finally exhale. Even after his death, the shadow of Richard Speck lingered. The crime he committed on that humid July night in 1966 had carved itself into the collective memory of Chicago and into the very fabric of American true crime history. It was not just the scale of the massacre at young nurses murdered in a single night, but the senselessness of it that left the deepest scar. Hospitals and nursing schools across the country reacted swiftly in the years following the murders. Dormitories that once left their doors unlocked began installing heavy locks, security systems, and curfews. Training programs adopted stricter safety measures, warning young nurses to remain vigilant, to never assume their workplace or home was free from danger. The idea that innocence alone was protection had been shattered forever. The story of Speck's crimes fueled books, documentaries, and endless debates. Some criminologists argued he was the embodiment of a broken system, an abused child, an alcoholic, a man chewed up by poverty and failure. Others saw him as something far simpler and far more terrifying, a monster who chose evil because it gave him power. The photographs of the nurses, smiling, vibrant, filled with promise, became symbols of what was lost. Their faces appeared in memorials, in the pages of newspapers, in the memories of families who never healed. Each one had left home with dreams of healing others, and each one had been robbed of that future in the cruelest way imaginable. Their legacy was not just tragedy, but also resilience. Survivors like Corazon Amaro carried their memory forward, turning trauma into testimony so that the world would never forget. And then there was the infamous prison tape that surfaced years after his death. It reignited public outrage, showing Speck boasting, smirking, living a life of drugs and indulgence behind bars. That tape became a symbol of the system's failures, a reminder that even in captivity, some criminals could still mock their victims and the public alike. To this day, criminologists, psychologists, and ordinary people still ask the same questions. Was Richard Speck a product of his environment, molded by abuse and neglect into something monstrous? Or was he always destined to become what he became? Embodiment of cruelty, a man without conscience, a predator waiting for his night. What is certain is that his name endures. Richard Speck remains one of the most infamous mass murderers in American history, a grim reminder that evil does not always announce itself with grandeur. Sometimes it walks in quietly, knife in hand, through an unlocked door. The legacy of fear he left behind still whispers in every story of true crime, still echoes in every reminder to lock doors at night. It still haunts the halls of nursing schools where the names of those 8 women are spoken with reverence. Richard Speck may be dead, but the terror he unleashed lives on. Nearly 6 decades have passed since that sweltering night in July 1966, yet the story of Richard Speck refuses to fade. His name is etched into the dark annals of true crime, not because he was cunning or brilliant, but because of the sheer brutality and senselessness of his acts. 8 women healers, dreamers, daughters were stripped of their futures in one night by a man whose only motive was rage and domination. Even now, the case stirs unease. When people look back, they don't just remember the killer, they remember the faces of the nurses, frozen in photographs, smiling in their white uniforms. Unaware of the fate that awaited them, they remember the lone survivor, Corazon Amaro, whose courage to hide beneath that bed and later testify against Speck ensured the world would know the truth. The case left behind more than grief. It forced America to confront questions it still struggles with today. Are monsters like Speck born, or are they created? Was he the product of a broken childhood, of abuse and neglect, of a system that failed to intervene? Or was he something darker, proof that some people carry evil in their marrow, waiting only for the chance to unleash it? Perhaps there will never be a clear answer. What is certain is that the horror of that night changed the way people lived. It changed how women thought about safety in their own homes, how communities viewed the strangers among them, how the justice system grappled with punishment. It showed, in the starkest way, how quickly ordinary life can collapse into nightmare. And that is why the story endures. Not because of Richard Speck himself, but because of what he represents, the fragility of safety, the cruelty of chance, the way one man's violence can ripple through generations. So I leave you with this question, one that has haunted every courtroom, every book, every retelling of this crime. Was Richard Speck a man twisted by the cruelty of the world, or was he born to be the monster he became? Tell me what you believe, down in the comments. Was he a victim of fate or the embodiment of it? And if you dare to confront the darkest corners of history, don't forget to subscribe. Because here, at Mr. True Death, We tell the stories others fear to whisper. The story of Richard Speck is finished, but the echo of that night in 1966 will never truly end.